If you look at the list of the Fortune 500 companies from the year 1955, and then you compare it to the list today, you will notice something startling. The vast majority of those companies, titans of industry, names that were once thought to be immortal, brands that were woven into the very fabric of American life, are gone. They have either gone bankrupt, been acquired, or faded into total irrelevance. The survival rate of a business over a long timeline is incredibly low. To the average observer, this looks like a tragedy. To Charles Koch, the man who built the second largest private company in America, this isn't a tragedy. It is an inevitability. It is the ruthless, necessary, and beautiful mechanism of what economists call creative destruction. When we ask the question, why do most businesses collapse? The easy answers are usually things like the economy turned, or a competitor undercut their prices, or marketing failed. But if you dig into the philosophy of Charles Koch, specifically the principles laid out in his framework of market-based management, you realize those are just symptoms. The disease lies much deeper. Businesses collapse because they fight a war against reality. They collapse because they try to preserve the past rather than inventing the future. They collapse because they organize themselves like bureaucracies rather than like ecosystems. And perhaps most dangerously, they collapse because they lose their moral center, chasing what Koch calls bad profit instead of good profit. Over the next 20 minutes or so, we are going to deconstruct the anatomy of business failure through the lens of Charles Koch. We have to start with the fundamental law of the universe that most CEOs try to ignore: entropy. The natural state of things is disorder. The market is not static. It is a chaotic, swirling storm of consumer preferences, technological breakthroughs, and shifting resources. Koch understands that a business is a living organism. If an organism stops adapting to its environment, it dies. The first and most common reason businesses collapse is a failure to accept the reality of creative destruction. Most companies achieve a level of success and then immediately build a fortress around it. They have a cash cow, a product or service that makes them rich, and they become terrified of anything that might threaten that product. They stop innovating because innovation carries risk. They stop looking at what the customer actually values today and keep forcing what the customer valued yesterday. Charles Koch argues that you must be willing to burn down your own business to save it. You have to be the one to make your own products obsolete before a competitor does. Look at the collapse of Kodak or Blockbuster. It wasn't that they didn't see digital cameras or streaming coming. It's that the internal incentives of the company were built to protect film and late fees. They valued the preservation of their current model over the creation of future value. In the Koch philosophy, this is the cardinal sin. If you are not actively engaged in the process of creative destruction, you are merely waiting to be destroyed. But why do smart people let this happen? Why do intelligent CEOs watch their companies sail off a cliff? This brings us to the second major cause of collapse: the centralization of knowledge, or what Friedrich Hayek, an economist who deeply influenced Koch, called the knowledge problem. In a small startup, the founder knows everything: the customers, the product, the cash flow. But as a business grows, knowledge becomes dispersed. The guy operating the machine on the factory floor knows something the CEO does not. The sales rep in Ohio knows something the vice president of marketing does not. Most businesses collapse because they try to run a complex organization like a dictatorship. Decisions are made at the top by people who have the least amount of specific local knowledge. By the time information travels from the front lines up to the boardroom, it is diluted, delayed, and distorted. Then, by the time the decision travels back down, the opportunity is gone. Koch's market-based management argues that a company should function like a free market. not a central command economy. When companies fail to push decision-making rights out to the people who actually have the knowledge, they become slow and stupid. They suffocate under their own weight. We see this in almost every large corporate collapse. The leadership was insulated from reality, surrounded by yes men, and disconnected from the granular details of the market. This ties directly into the third reason for collapse, which is a misalignment of incentives. In many failing companies, employees are paid for showing up, for tenure, or for pleasing their boss. They are not paid for creating value. When you disconnect a person's reward from their contribution, you breed mediocrity. Charles Koch is famous for paying employees not based on their title or budget size, but on the value they create for the company. In a collapsing business, you often see the principal-agent problem. The managers, the agents, act in their own self-interest rather than the interest of the company, the principal. They might pursue a vanity project to boost their resume or hide bad news to protect their annual bonus. When a culture allows employees to profit while the company suffers, collapse is only a matter of time. Let's go deeper into the culture because this is where the rot often starts. A massive driver of business failure is the prioritization of skills over values. When a company is growing fast, there is a temptation to hire the brilliant jerk, the top-tier salesman who lies to customers, or the genius engineer who destroys team morale. Charles Koch places virtue ahead of talent. This is not just a nice slogan, it is a survival strategy. If you hire people who lack integrity, who do not share the vision of the company, the internal transaction costs skyrocket. You have to spend all your time policing them, checking their work, and cleaning up their messes. A company filled with talented but unprincipled people will eventually implode. They will cut corners on safety, leading to disasters. They will skirt the law, leading to regulatory crackdowns, or they will simply eat each other alive in a game of office politics. Koch Industries has famously exited profitable businesses and fired high-performing individuals because they didn't align with the company's values. Most businesses don't have the stomach for that. They keep the high performer who is toxic, and that toxicity spreads like a virus until the culture is destroyed. Once the culture is gone, the business is just a hollow shell waiting for a strong wind to knock it over. Now we have to talk about the concept of profit. This is where Koch is often misunderstood and where many businesses get it wrong. A major reason for collapse is the pursuit of short-term profit at the expense of long-term value. Koch distinguishes between good profit and bad profit. Good profit comes from creating value for customers, giving them something they value more than the money they part with, while using resources more efficiently than your competitors. This is the only sustainable business model. Bad profit, on the other hand, comes from corporate welfare, seeking government subsidies, rigging regulations to hurt competitors, or deceiving customers. Many businesses collapse because they become addicted to bad profit. They spend their energy lobbying politicians for protection rather than innovating for customers. This is called cronyism. It works for a while. It can make you very rich for a few years, but it makes the business fragile. If the political winds shift, or if the subsidy is removed, the business cannot stand on its own 2 feet. Furthermore, relying on cronyism corrupts the internal culture. It teaches employees that success comes from manipulation rather than creation. Koch argues that for a business to survive for generations, it must provide real value to society. It must have a vision that focuses on long-term value creation. If your vision is just make the stock price go up next quarter, you will eventually cut the R&D, training, and maintenance budgets required to survive the next decade. This brings us to the psychological aspect of failure, epistemic arrogance. This is a fancy way of saying thinking you know more than you do. Humility is a competitive advantage. The moment a business leadership team thinks they have figured it all out, they are dead. The market is a discovery process. It is always teaching you things. If you stop listening, you stop learning. Koch emphasizes knowledge processes, systematically gathering internal and external knowledge to challenge your own assumptions. Think about the collapse of the American auto industry in the 1970s and 80s relative to the Japanese. Detroit was arrogant. They believed they knew what the American consumer wanted: big, gas-guzzling cars. They ignored the signals. They ignored the rising efficiency of foreign competitors. They lacked the humility to admit their models were wrong. By the time they accepted reality, they had lost decades of ground. A business must cultivate a culture where challenge is encouraged. If a junior employee cannot tell the CEO, "I think you're wrong, and here is the data why," then that company is in danger. In a market-based management system, anyone can challenge anyone, provided they have the data. Silence and conformity are the precursors to collapse. Let's look at the structure of decision-making again, specifically decision rights. In a failing company, decision rights are usually tied to hierarchy. The higher you are, the more decisions you make. This is absurd. Decision rights should be based on comparative advantage. Who is best positioned to make this specific decision? Sometimes that is the CEO, sometimes that is the maintenance tech. When businesses grow, they tend to add layers of middle management. These layers exist primarily to approve or deny the actions of others. They become bottlenecks. They slow down the metabolic rate of the company. Charles Koch views the corporation not as a hierarchy to be climbed, but as a network of capabilities. When a company becomes bureaucratic, it loses the ability to experiment. And without experimentation, there is no evolution. You have to try things, and you have to fail. But, and this is key, you have to fail small. Failing companies often bet the farm on one massive ego-driven acquisition or product launch that flops. Successful companies, according to Koch, run constant small experiments. They test, they learn, and they scale what works. If you punish failure, people stop experimenting. If people stop experimenting, innovation dies. If innovation dies, the company collapses. Another subtle but fatal error is the misidentification of the company's core capabilities. What are you actually good at? Many businesses collapse because they wander into fields where they have no comparative advantage. They chase the hot thing. A fertilizer company tries to become a tech company. A car company tries to become a bank. Koch Industries is a conglomerate, yes, but they operate based on capabilities. They ask, does our expertise in processing raw materials apply here? If yes, they enter. If no, they stay away. Diluting your focus and capital into areas where you are not the best in the world is a fast track to mediocrity and eventual failure. You must know what you are, and more importantly, what you are not. We must also address the tragedy of the commons within a corporation. In a failing business, departments fight each other for budget and resources. Marketing fights sales. Engineering fights operations. They hoard information. They treat their department's success as more important than the company's success. This internal friction generates heat but no light. It wastes an immense amount of energy. Koch's philosophy requires that everyone understands how their role contributes to the whole. If the incentives are set up so that I win, if my department wins, even if the company loses, the company will eventually tear itself apart. Market-based management tries to align these interests, creating an internal ecosystem where cooperation is rational and selfishness is punished. Let's pause and consider the role of the government and society again, because this is a pillar of Koch's worldview. He believes that for a business to survive long-term, it must have principled entrepreneurship. This means operating within the bounds of law and integrity, but also advocating for a free society. Why? because a society that lacks economic freedom eventually stifles business. If a business is complicit in the erosion of property rights or the rule of law, it is sawing off the branch it sits on. Businesses collapse when the society around them collapses or becomes hostile to commerce. Therefore, the long-term survival of a business is tied to the health of the society in which it operates. A business that exploits its community or environment creates a liability that will eventually come due. This isn't just about being nice, it's about risk management. If you poison the water table, you might save money this quarter, but you have guaranteed a lawsuit or regulation that will bankrupt you in 10 years. Koch views this through the lens of long-term value. You cannot create value by destroying the systems you rely on. Now let's weave these threads together into a narrative of the life cycle of a collapse. It usually starts with success. The company does something well. It grows. Then pride sets in. The leaders begin to believe their success is due to their innate genius, not their specific solution to a market problem. They stop listening to the market. They hire people who flatter them rather than challenge them. They create rigid hierarchies to control their growing empire, stifling the flow of information. They prioritize short-term earnings to please Wall Street, cutting the investments needed for the future. They seek government protection to lock out competitors rather than out-innovating them. The culture shifts from create value to protect status. Talented, principled people leave because they feel stifled. Mediocre, political people stay and climb the ladder. Finally, a shock hits the system, a new technology, a recession, a global pandemic. Because the company has become rigid, blind, and bloated, it cannot pivot. It shatters. This is the script of almost every corporate funeral in history. So, what is the antidote? If we listen to Charles Koch, the antidote is to remain eternally in day one. It is to apply the principles of a free society inside the walls of the corporation. It is to define the vision clearly. We exist to make people's lives better. It is to select people based on their values and then empower them to use their unique talents. It is to create a republic of science where the best idea wins regardless of who proposes it. It is to align incentives so that every employee feels the weight and the reward of ownership. It sounds simple, but it is incredibly hard. It requires a leader to give up control. It requires a leader to admit they don't know the answer. It requires a constant, grueling commitment to education and culture. Most leaders aren't willing to do that. They want the corner office and the feeling of power, and that is why most businesses collapse. They collapse because they are built to serve the ego of the management rather than the needs of the market. To avoid collapse, a business must become an engine of learning. It must treat every failure as a data point, not a crime. It must recognize that its current products are temporary, but its principles can be permanent. Koch Industries has survived and grown for decades, not because they are in the oil business or the paper business or the chemical business. They have survived because they are in the capability business. They are in the business of applying a specific philosophy of management to convert resources into value. If you are running a business or working in one, look around you. Are decisions made by those with knowledge or those with rank? Is bad news hidden or shared? Are you innovating or are you protecting? Do you hire for character or just for resume? Are you seeking good profit or bad profit? The answers to these questions will tell you if your organization is building a foundation for the next 50 years or if it is already in the early stages of collapse. The market is ruthless, but it is fair. It rewards those who create value and destroys those who consume it. The choice ultimately is whether to embrace the chaos of creative destruction or to be its victim. Most choose to be victims because it is easier in the short run, but for the few who choose to embrace the principles of human flourishing and market dynamics, longevity is possible. In the end, business is a social institution. Its purpose is to improve the human condition. When it loses sight of that purpose, it loses its right to exist. And the market, in its infinite wisdom, will eventually revoke its license. That is why businesses collapse. They forget why they are there. They forget that their master is not the CEO, not the shareholder, but the customer and the society they serve. Adapting to that truth is the only path to survival.